Hindi cinema has been a traveling cinema. It has been traveling for a long time. And when we talk about the global flows of Bollywood, we seem to ignore these earlier flows of Hindi cinema, which have been going on almost for 100 years. In this module, in this unit, I'm going to take you to the old and the new spaces, exhibition spaces of Hindi cinema and also Bollywood cinema, to show you that global flows of cinema, of Indian cinema, predate the flows of Bollywood cinema beginning in the 90s. When did these flows begin? How did the Hindi films, how did not just Hindi films, how did Indian films travel before the era of globalization? Where did they travel? Who was watching these films? And what is the impact that they had on people who watched these films? What effects did they have on different groups of people who watched these films? So the question we are going to explore in this unit is, who's watching Bollywood's films? And we'll get the answer by looking at who was watching Indian films in the past. The title is Bollywood at Large. I'm going to look at the narrative of globalization, cosmopolitanism and mondialization. So on one hand we have Christianity, the civilizing mission, the development of the global market, and each of these corresponds to different global designs and certainly originates different local histories corresponding to the same global designs. We define globalization as a set of designs to manage the world, and we oppose it with cosmopolitanism, which is a set of projects towards planetary conviviality. And mondialization is defined as local histories in which global designs are enacted, or where they have to be adapted, adopted, transformed and re-articulated. So I'm going to summarize this once again. I'm going to make a contrast between globalization, which is a set of designs to manage the world, and borrow the definition in which cosmopolitanism is understood as a set of projects towards planetary conviviality. So one is a positive aspect of globalization and the other is a negative aspect of globalization. And mondialization is a process in which local histories in which global designs are enacted, or where they have to be adapted, adopted, transformed and re-articulated. And I would look at these, the movements, the travels of Indian cinema in the past as well as those in the present, corresponding to different global designs, and certainly originates different local histories responding to the same global designs. So as these we read it in the context of the fears about Hollywood cinema swamping the world and driving out all local cinemas, all local Indian industries. And Indian cinema is a living example, is a shining example, if we may say, to how it has it has not only withstood the onslaught of Hollywood cinema in the era of globalization, but it has always offered stiff competition to Hollywood cinema even in the past, with audience not only in South Asia but also in some other parts of the world preferring Indian cinema to productions from Hollywood or from the West. Now the objective of this unit is to trace the different stages of Hindi cinema's movement in order to compare Bollywood's contemporary global flows with Hindi films' broader crossings in the imperial and national era. How are they different? And I'm going to make a distinction between distribution and circulation. So, in the first stage, what I see is a distribution, not necessarily in the first stage, because it cuts across both the stages. On one hand, we have distribution of Indian films, the formal distribution of Indian films during colonialism, during nation building and globalization, and this distribution is essentially controlled by status policies on distribution, export or exhibition. On the other hand, we have circulation of the same films through porous legalities, and this circulation, which I would call leakage, is an example of globalization from below. It's an example of mondialization, which marries politics with pragmatics. And I've used the term, the metaphor leakage, a term which is often used in India to talk about, to show how I prefer this term to the term jugaad, which is in common currency now, to show how leaking is the way Indians have always gotten around bent rules, have gotten around bureaucratic procedures, have crossed boundaries, and this is an appropriate metaphor for describing how Indian films have always leaked across the borders of India. We begin with the colonial era and the understanding of imperial territories as a global market. I'm indebted to Priya Jaykumar's book, where she talks about how the entire empire was considered a single territory as far as the marketing of or distribution of films were concerned, not just the marketing and production and consumption, but also in terms of policies. The entire market was seen as all imperial territories were seen as a single global market, and that meant the uniformity of imperial policies across the colonies. And the imperial anxieties, so ironically, imperial anxieties about Hollywood cinema on the effects of on British authority. We are talking about a British power, a British empire in crisis, extremely anxious about its dwindling authority or sovereignty over native populations, and the role of cinema, the perceived role of cinema in reinforcing certain stereotypes and constructing a negative image of white races among the native people, of white people as depraved or morally corrupt. And for this reason, the British imperial government adopts a policy, introduces an act which its worries, anxieties about Hollywood cinema's effects on the superiority of the white race would entail for the British Empire, encourage the exhibition and distribution of Indian films in India and in the Indian diaspora. And how did this happen? This happened with the introduction of the Cinematographic or Quota Act of 1927, which stipulated that a certain only a very small percentage of the films exhibited in the empire would be Hollywood films. The majority of the films should be films produced in the empire. Now, the renters who exhibited films, they exploited the loopholes in the act for very pragmatic rather than benevolent reasons. They wanted to maximize their profits, and they found that Indian films produced in India technically qualified as empire films, but were considerably cheaper than films made in Britain. And the renters were the people who were not necessarily Indians, who were the first to have exhibited Indian films in the diaspora to meet the requirements of the Quota Act. And this is how Indian films came to be exhibited in the various Indian diasporas, often with the complicity of British officials in India who believed that these films would be appropriate entertainment for Indian coolies and Indian workers in the plantations and the various diasporas, rather than Hollywood films, which would have a negative impact on the power of or sovereignty of white people over native people in the perception of the native viewers. So, due to this act, Indian films have been traveling to the Indian diasporas ever since the 30s. We are talking about the era of silent cinema, the silent era, and Indian cinema began almost around, it's almost coeval with cinema in other parts of the world, with in the first film having been made in the second decade of the 20th century. And by the 30s, Indian films were already being exhibited in the Indian diasporas to Indian plantation workers, namely in so it was Samikanu Vincent's tent cinemas, an very enterprising exhibitor who took his films not only who took his traveling tent cinema not only to different parts of India. I must first of all bring to your notice that films were not exhibited in cinema halls before in the 30s. They were still being exhibited in open air theaters or in tent cinemas, not only in India but in the diasporas. And it was Samikanu Vincent's tent cinemas which travelled to Burma, Malaya and to other places. And some of the earliest, now the films that were exhibited, since this was the silent era, in the silent era, the films could have been in any Indian, were Indian films rather than Hindi films. And even after the coming of, with the coming of sound, not only Hindi films but films in other languages, for instance Tamil films, because the majority of migrant workers in the British Malaya were Tamil speaking. Tamil films were also being shown. One of the earliest Tamil films was Vali Tirumanam, but one is not quite sure whether this film was exhibited by Samikanu Vincent, but films like this were being shown in the plantations in British Malaya. It was the same with Fiji, and we have anecdotal evidence from Fijians like Vijay Mishra, who talk about having watched several mythological films in their childhood. And there is more evidence of the film Bala Joban being screened in Trinidad, in the West in Trinidad in 1934, and films traveled to Trinidad in 1930, not only Fiji but also to the West Indies, including to Trinidad and Guyana. And Bala Joban, which was made in 1934, was one such film. Now, during the World War and the independence movements, there was another market for opening up for Indian films, and this was a market for films not only in places where Indian troops were stationed, but also in other regions, in regions in which Indian diasporas were located, or places which had an earlier history of the exhibition of Indian films like British Malaya, but not only to meet the diaspora's need to connect with the homeland. Obviously, the plantation workers who had no hope of returning home, and in that era of low connectivity, had almost nil connection with the homeland. The sole connection they had with the homeland were the myths that were myths of the homeland that they created in relation to the Hindi films they saw. And as Mishra puts it, these became new myths along with the old myths like the epics, the Hindu epics, and the other Puranic myths for these plantation workers or the Indian diasporas, the older diasporas. But with the Second World War, they was deemed as a right entertainment for Indian troops. But it was a more interesting, a very different reason, which created a taste for Indian films in the British Malaya, particularly in Singapore, and that was due to the Japanese occupation of the Straits Settlements, when the Japanese took over the two major cinema conglomerates rather than cinema houses in the Straits Settlements, namely Shaw Brothers and Cathay, who were forced to become managers of the Japanese, owners were forced to become managers of the Japanese, and the audience were offered a choice between watching Japanese propaganda films and Indian films. For reasons very different from the British, the Japanese also discouraged the screening of Hollywood films because they were made by Americans, because they were made in America, and indirectly, unwittingly encouraged the viewing of Hindi films or Indian films in Singapore. So obviously the audience preferred Indian films, which was seen by the Japanese as harmless and pure entertainment, in the same manner as the British saw them as harmless and pure entertainment for the purpose of keeping the plantation workers happy. But as a result of this, a new audience for Indian films emerged in the Straits Settlement. Not only the Malay people of the Straits Settlements, who have always been big fans of Indian films from the beginning, a certain generation of Chinese audience also grew up on these films they watched in theaters during the Japanese occupation, and became big fans of Indian films. Now, when we move from Singapore to Indonesia, we find Indian films traveled to Indonesia in 1945 with the Indian troops, and they were very important in the since there was no local Indonesian film industry. They were very important in the founding of the film industry, both in Singapore and in Indonesia, as well as in 1940s they traveled to Sri Lanka, where again it was during the Second World War, and they were meant for the entertainment of troops. Now, I have an image of 10 cinemas. This is not really an image of 10 cinemas in Singapore, but an image from Amit Madhesia's 10 cinemas. And we find that when we look at the cinematic assemblage in Singapore, it's anchored to several other assemblages. The contemporary assemblage is anchored to other assemblages of older Tamil and Sikh Singaporeans and new professional migrants, Nepali, Bengali guest workers, Malays, and a few Chinese. Now, in 1956, between 1956 to 1962, we have evidence, we have records of the formal distribution and export of Indian films overseas. This is, I have taken the UNESCO report as to support to get information about where and how many films were exported during these years, and according to this report, it's only 10% of the total films produced between 56 and 62 were exported to the West, and the remaining 90% were exported to the traditional markets of Indian films in both in the West and the non-West. but mainly in East Africa, Thailand, Malaya, Ceylon. I'm using the all names because these are the names used in the report. Burma, Vietnam and Persian Gulf, which have traditionally formed the markets for Indian films since the 50s or even earlier. Now 100 films were exported during these years to the West, and out of these 0.5% share was taken by Russia. So majority Russia emerged as a major market for Indian films during this period. This was the era of the alliances that India was was trying to form with Russia, and the export of Indian films was tacitly and actively encouraged by the Indian state, and we have images of the film actors Raj Kapoor and Nargis accompanying Pandit Nehru on his visits to US. And as a result of that export of Indian films in Russia in the 50s and the 60s, Russia still remains a major market for Indian films even today, and there's an entire dubbing industry in Russia based on Indian films. China was another market, and some of the films, the old Chinese still remember songs from Raj Kapoor films. Once again, these were the Raj Kapoor films, namely the films Awara, and you'd find Chinese singing Awala Hu in China. There are reports that 111 films were exported to Greece. They were exported to countries of Eastern Europe such as Bulgaria, and during the 70s we find, and I wanted to show, I've used this picture of a screening of a film in multiplex in Bangkok, in the Central Mall in Bangkok, and the two Sikhs that you see in the picture, whose faces are not visible, they are the sons of the person who was the sole distributor of Indian films in all of Southeast Asia until the 70s. Now, with the ending of the formal export of Indian films in Southeast Asia, the brothers have been forced to turn over to other more lucrative businesses, but out of respect for their father's memory, they still hold viewings, they still organize viewings of Indian films, at least on one Sunday or one weekend in a month, largely of the hit Bollywood films, as a homage to their father's memory. But the reports are that in the 70s, for some reason, there was a decline in the export of Indian films overseas. And these reports have come from various regions, from the Caribbean, from Thailand, from Africa. Audience in Africa who I have interviewed recall having watched many of the films of the 70s in theaters. Similarly, audience in Indonesia remember being taken to watch Indian films in theaters in Jakarta, for instance, or in Ghana, in Tanzania. Both diasporic Indians as well as non-Indians, Africans recall having regularly watched films in theatre. Mera Naam Joker in Tanzania, for instance, which was screened in open-air theatres in Tanzania. And my respondent, who's now based in Canada, recalls having watched Sholay in 1976 in Ghana when he was a schoolboy, and he bunked school to watch the film Sholay. So what was interesting here is that there's a complete change in the audience of Indian films from the Indian diasporas in the old diasporas such as Fiji, Trinidad, Tobago, the British Malaya, where the presence of the Indian diaspora also creates a taste for Indian films among other people in the in the places of settlement, such as the Malay in the Straits settlement, followed by the Chinese, and in Africa we find my respondent shared with me that she watched Mera Naam Joker 13 times in Tanzania. And those of us who watched Mera Naam Joker, yes, it has become a cult film today, but when it was released in 1970, it was one of the major flops of Raj Kapoor. So I was very curious to know why would anybody want to watch the film 13 times. And the answer was that people did not go to watch films in the diasporas. The reason why they went to watch films or watched a film 13 times in the diaspora was that the films helped them produce certain forms of sociality, doing the Indian thing, dressing Indian, speaking Indian languages, eating Indian food, and just letting their hair down. So this was up to the 70s, and one of the reasons which I surmise could have been responsible for the decline or almost the ending of the formal exports or distribution of Indian films overseas was the 70s video boom. So an informal economy mushroomed during this period, which was decentralized, which was uncontrolled, and whose ownership was also distributed. Now this economy, this video boom, is an example of mondialization because it challenges the monopoly of state-controlled media. Because of the absence of provisions related to exhibition in Censorship Act, it was possible for people to circulate and view films in video parlors. So one is curious to know that when Hindi films were no longer being formally screened in cinema halls, or they were not being exported, even to there's always been a ban on Indian films in neighboring nations like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where no films were screened after 65. How is it that generations of viewers in those nations are familiar with films produced during this era? And the answer is the video boom, because copies of films were being illegally produced in Pakistan and distributed by a company based in Dubai and being circulated all across the world in parlors such as this. This is an image of a parlor in Bangkok, opposite the Vadda Gurdwara in Bangkok, and it's a perfect example of the porous legalities that Ravi Sundaram and others talk about, because in technical terms it stands on the cusp of legality and illegality, because it is really circulating pirated videos of Indian films, CDs and DVDs of Indian films. But the owner's wife you see in the video doesn't look much like a pirate to me, and the video, it is parlors like this or CD shops like this which kept alive the taste for Indian films, not only in the diasporic audience, the NRI audience in different parts of the world, but also in non-diasporic, the local ethnic audience. For instance, in this video parlor, I came upon several Thais walking in to come and rent DVDs or buy DVDs of Hindi films, of the latest Hindi films. When I expressed my surprise, I was told that the Thais are big lovers, have been always a big lovers of Indian films, and again there's an entire dubbing industry based on Indian films in Thailand, and these Thais were borrowing the dubbed versions of the films from this video parlor. So the global flows, which have been enabled by satellite television, through cable networks, through internet, theatrical exhibition, have created new markets for Indian films overseas, There have always been these traditional markets, but now we have new markets of Indian films, which changes according to the direction, the class and age of the audience. So, there is an intermixing. The new markets are in the old traditional markets of Bollywood films, but they have also spread to new areas in the West, new generations of viewers, and these porous legalities and subculture of piracy, there's a sphere of illegality, the production, distribution, exhibition, the porous avenues, porous boundaries and avenues of participation they offer to viewers. They allow them to watch films and allow them to perform forms of sociality which would not be available to them otherwise. So, in Dubai, it's Bollywood nights on the weekends for the majority of work laborers across the UAE who can enjoy blockbusters on the wide screen for free. This is Sunita Menon reporting on 2007. We will move on in the next session. We'll compare the old markets, the traditional markets of Bollywood films with new markets for Bollywood film through 2 case studies. Thank you.